Hello, Agents of Spectre, and welcome to Circuit Court Entertainment, where we discuss how laws and history have an effect on all forms of media. I'm your host, Bina, and today we are discussing a post-holiday comfort marathon of movies, the James Bond films. And I did not realize how far this all went. Please, let's get started. James Bond as a character debuted in 1952. Crafted by Navy officer and ex-World War II intelligence officer Ian Fleming, Bond drew upon Fleming's hypothetical spy work and real co-workers as he wrote in the post-war era. I say hypothetical because Fleming never really saw action. He worked as an aide to a lieutenant, and he often did liaisons with the codebreakers. There are a few plans that can be traced to him, namely one named Operation Ruthless, which, well, they sound like a James Bond plot. Said Operation Ruthless involved getting a hold of a World War II plane, man it with English soldiers disguised as Germans, crash the plane, wait to get rescued, kill everyone on the rescue ship, and steal the Germans' Enigma codebook. They were getting desperate for the code by that point in the war, but still, that is a James Bond plot and possible war crime. And post-war, Fleming was able to make Bond stories to his heart's content. Okay, well, it took several contacts within his family and his co-workers, but the first book, Casino Royale, sold very well. This work would continue to define the next and last decade and a half of his life. Bond novels did considerably well, but the public's demand for them eventually wore him out. Fleming still had a lot to do. He wrote several books: Casino Royale, Live and Let Die, Moonraker, Diamonds Are Forever, From Russia with Love, Dr. No, Goldfinger, For Your Eyes Only, only a few short stories, Thunderball, The Spy Who Loved Me, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and You Only Live Twice. This was followed by two posthumous novels, The Man with the Golden Gun and Octopussy and the Living Daylights, which were 4 short stories combined into one novel, with those two being the title stories. James Bond was wildly popular. Popular enough that there were some adaptations that Fleming was trying to work on too. CBS premiered an American James Bond in 1954. This adaptation was 1 hour and made the British characters American and vice versa. Moonraker was adapted into a radio play in 1958. Also in 1958, the James Bond comic adaptations debuted. These ran daily and adapted the novels into its comic form, something Fleming was averse to, but he did eventually agree to. At the same time, literary criticism was beginning to bear down on the novels, which was unfortunate. James Bond was not the most cheerful of characters. Maybe he wasn't trigger-happy, but he was in a grim business, and what appears to be Fleming's prejudices, such as sexism, racism, and homophobia, continue to dog Bond, which grew to weary critics, on top of general critiques on Fleming's writing style, tone, etc. But Fleming was trying to get Bond into yet another adaptation: film. However, Fleming was a novelist, not a scriptwriter, and those two are entirely different skills. The Bond books notably spent a lot of time in Bond's head, leaving it as more of a monologue with action in it. Long story short, the books were functionally unfilmable without either drastic alterations or doing an entirely new story. Enter Kevin McClory. He and Fleming had a mutual friend, Ivor Bryce, and in fact McClory had a history of working in film with his own contacts. Having worked in a minor but regular capacity for films such as The African Queen and Moby Dick, he had started striking out on his own and had a new film coming up called The Boy in the Bridge. McClory agreed Bond could be adapted, but thought an original story would work better. Drawing from some of their background and modern politics, they created what would become the book Thunderball. Except, well, it wasn't supposed to go that way. It was supposed to be an original Bond. Like I said, it was going to be an original story for the movie, but the movie side was falling apart. The Boy in the Bridge did not do well at all. Their initial director picks, including Alfred Hitchcock, after seeing North by Northwest and realizing how similar it was to Bond, had to pull out, and McClory and Fleming were increasingly fractured. McClory was next up to direct, but the script still wasn't quite right, and the pre-production had now dragged on about 3 years. Sahara and that trouble production was closer to 4. When the editors were pressuring Fleming to write another novel, Fleming, exhausted, turned the original movie plot into a novel, without telling anyone else. Like Kevin McClory, who was not happy. McClory had gotten a hold of an advanced copy in 1961 and found a lot of things that were either similar or suspiciously changed. The plot about the heist of a nuclear weapons in midair was an admitted McClory plot point. Spectre is from the script, but it's unclear if it's McClory or Fleming. What is clear is that Spectre was not the initial bad guy. Instead, it was the real-world Russians, but they had just been dismissed over the fears of the Cold War ending soon. Other people's names, but not their jobs or plot points, were changed, marking it as plagiarism. The case only lasted for about 9 days, starting in March 24, 1991. Not that no one had a case, more because Fleming had a heart attack and was recovering, on top of the money people had spent already getting the case to court for years, on top of various other related fees, being just completely out of proportion to the subject matter, in addition to other pre-production woes. But it was pretty clear that McClory was in the right, on top of the fact Fleming had made no acknowledgement or alerted McClory, so it seemed apparent he knew that he, Fleming, was plagiarizing. Plus, by the time the case made it to court, Dr. No had been released in 1962, which borrowed some things from the Thunderball original treatment. Things were eventually settled, mostly. McClory got his name added to additional Thunderball printings and could use part of that script to make additional James Bond films, if it's based on Thunderball. So cue the Bond trivia question standard. When was Sean Connery's last outing as James Bond? That was 1983's Never Say Never Again. This was not released by the traditional James Bond production company, Eon Productions, but a different company called Talia Film and distributed by Warner Brothers. This is an adaptation of Thunderball. It had been 12 years since Connery's last outing, and it did decent. Adjusted for inflation, it made $507 million, or roughly 2.5 Saharas. But that wasn't the only Bond released around that time. Roger Moore was nearing the end of his successful run, with his second-to-last movie, Octopussy, also coming out that year. It also did well. At adjusted $580 million, it made closer to 3 Saharas. There was speculation about more Connery Bonds, but at this point, Connery had had enough, and while McClory could adapt Thunderball points into Bond movies, there was only a limited well to draw from. Mostly. Because the Thunderball script treatment was where we got the James Bond villainous organization, Spectre. If you cast your mind back to the Sahara episode, I mentioned that Clive Cussler liked to make the villains the topical real-life political issues of the day for his dark pit adventures. While that would give him a lot of material to work with, it can lead to things being either dated or half-formed. Sahara's focus on Mali warlords was topical when the book was released in the 90s, but in 2005, at best all context was lost for anyone who was not aware of the Traore regime. Me. I'm talking about me. I just took it as a generic evil warlord general when I watched it for the first time. This also bit Cussler when the Titanic was actually found a few years later after Raise the Titanic was published, and it was discovered that the Titanic was split into half. To keep issues like that from happening with the Bond films, in addition for it to be nearing the end of the Cold War, where countries would change in size, name, or even existence quite frequently, Spectre was used as a catch-all organization, unchanging in all the conflict. And I'm not joking with the frequency. Famously, the first season of PBS's 1991 geography game show, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, was rendered inaccurate between taping and airing due to the USSR dissolving and Yugoslavia splitting into different countries. James Bond wasn't going to risk that. Spectre was a great option, and even years later you can see its influence on various shows and movies. Austin Powers, Inspector Gadget, Darkwing Duck, Get Smart, and several others have some villainous shadowy organization with a pun-based acronym and often a bad guy stroking a cat. If you also know your Bond stories, you know that Spectre disappeared from film with their final appearance being 1971's Diamonds Are Forever. Deals had been struck that would allow Eon to use Spectre for 10 years if McClory held off on making his own Bond movie, and that time was up. For Your Eyes Only in 1981 snuck a cameo of Blofeld in, or at least someone resembling Spectre's lead villain, but that was it. In 1998, Kevin McClory tried to remake Thunderball again, this time called Warhead 2000 AD with Sony. MGM sued. Their arguments were threefold. 1. Any copyright McClory did hold expired in 1989. With the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act, which froze copyright expirations for 20 years, only coming to bear in 1998, that was possibly valid. Second, they argued that a key player had misused trade secrets. John Calley, Sony Pictures' new president, had just come over from MGM, and, well, MGM's big seller was James Bond. It wasn't impossible that McClory had coaxed information from Calley about Bond. And yes, that does happen. I can point to the rumors about Michael Eisner in Florida parks, but that's too off track. Point is, it's not provable, but it's not impossible. And not stated, but definitely there, MGM just wanted McClory to go away. The book came out in '61. James Bond was still a hit, but the movie's format was rapidly becoming dated. Fleming had died in 1964. Austin Powers secured Bond in similar movies so thoroughly that Daniel Craig emphatically cites it as a reason the Bond franchise failed, and they didn't recover until his own stripped-down debut in 2007. The Cold War had functionally ended in 1991 when the USSR dissolved. Throw in the increasing cross-promotion and commercial tie-ins to the point of distraction in the movies, something they needed to do with their increasing budget, and McClory was just one thing too many. I'm not sure how long the case went, probably to 1999, but all I know is articles call it quick, and MGM is considered to have won. Warhead 2018 never came out. McClory stuck by his case until he died in 2006, and in 2013, the case was finally settled. The estate sold MGM the rights for an undisclosed amount, and in 2015, Daniel Craig's second-to-last outing proudly carried the name Spectre, which, having watched it, it was fine. Skyfall, the previous one, is just so good that it is hard to keep up with that quality. James Bond is complicated, and this is just part of his history in effect. I don't even have time to get into this time MGM sued Honda because a car commercial was too similar to James Bond, and something called the Sam Spade case was invoked, which is something I'm going to have to look into. And so, to quote the film's credits, James Bond will return. Thank you for listening to Circuit Court Entertainment. If you found this episode interesting, please tell others as this is a new podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review on all the major podcast services. You can find me on Twitter at CCEPod and Tumblr at Circuit Court Entertainment. This episode was written, edited, and recorded by me, Mina. The script was edited by CJ Peterson. Podcast art by Empress Cirque on Twitter. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you soon.